In this module, we're going to learn about the specific supervision and training requirements for when we as BCBAs are training aspiring behavior analysts. So those individuals that are going to pursue their BCBA certification. There are very specific supervisory qualifications that you need to meet in order to supervise individuals that are pursuing field experience towards their certification requirements. Thus far, we've been talking about components of good supervision and training in general as they relate to anyone that might need to employ uh, anyone you might need to train, whether it's staff, parents, etc. But in terms of making sure that you meet the requirements to supervise BCBA applicants, you have to be a BCBA or BCBAD at the time of providing that supervision, or licensed as a psychologist that has been tested in the applied behavior analysis domain through the uh, behavioral cognitive and psychology test. You will find that most individuals who are supervising people that are pursuing certification are BCBAs themselves. Additionally, you have to pass an 8-hour competency-based training before you can supervise, and these are typically provided as CE trainings that you would do outside of your graduate coursework. The curriculum is consistent across the board as outlined by the BACB, so it may be delivered in different ways, either online or in person. Remember that you have to take and pass that 8-hour training and submit that documentation to the BACB before you can actually start supervising anyone who's pursuing their certification. It's a pretty big time commitment. 8 hours is not your typical kind of workshop or CE webinar. So after you pass that training and submit your information to the board, you'll get a notification or a little designation in the registry that says you're eligible to supervise, and then you can go on to acquire the requisite continuing education credits each recertification cycle. Once you're certified, you have to get 3 hours of CEs related to supervision in order to maintain supervisory designation. So if you lapse and don't get 3 credits of supervision related continuing education, then not only does that remove your supervisory qualifications, but it can jeopardize the hours of anyone that you're currently supervising in terms of those hours counting towards their BCBA requirements. So make sure that you actually stay on top of your CE requirements once you've been certified. Now, starting in 2022, you can no longer supervise aspiring behavior analysts for at least 1 year after you get certified. So once you get your BCBA, you need to wait a year before you start supervising. The rationale is that during that first year as a BCBA, you do your 8-hour training, get more intensive supervision yourself, so that you really are well prepared to supervise others after that first year upon completing the eligibility requirements. The other option for that is that if you are in a system where, for whatever reason, you really need to start supervising immediately after certification, you can do so as long as you're getting monthly consultative supervision from a BCBA who has 5+ years of supervisory experience. If you choose to go down that path, make sure to familiarize yourself with the BACB's explicit instructions outlined in the consulting supervisor requirements for new BCBA supervising fieldwork document. As a supervisor of aspiring behavior analysts, you have to be mindful of those specific field experience requirements. These are always available, published on the BACB website, but they are constantly changing. For example, new standards that came into effect for individuals who are taking their test in 2022 and beyond have been discussed since 2017. And just last month, the BACB announced that it will be coming out with the next edition of the task list to be implemented starting 2025. So it's really important as a supervisor that you stay up to date on all of those basic newsletters coming out and the changes within them. Remember that our field is really in its infancy in many regards, and that we're trying to make as many timely database decisions as we can with regards to improving the training and supervision requirements of our future practitioners for the better of the field, for providing better client care, but that can be quite cumbersome for you to keep track of. If you are supervising individuals pursuing their certification, Code 4.01 of the Ethics Code specifically says that you are responsible for being aware of all things related to supervision and providing a training experience that meets those requirements. So you cannot rely on your supervisee to inform you of any changes or keep you up to date on these things. It is your ethical obligation to make sure you're providing supervision and training in accordance with the most current guidelines that are published. At this point, I will caution you to remember and relate to supervisory criteria and requirements as constantly evolving and not to get stuck on or default to the standards that you were trained on, because things are likely to have changed since your training. While it can be overwhelming to keep track of all of this, it's important that you do, even if you're not going to be a supervisor, because it's important for you to understand what the new training requirements are. So, what skill sets newly minted BCBAs are coming into the field with. In terms of the broad scope of field experience requirements, the first thing you have to have before you start supervision with your specific student is a supervisory contract. This makes sense that this is required because remember, we have an ethical code that stipulates that we have to really very clearly define all the expectations and objectives of any activities that we're delegating to our supervisees. In the contract, it's really important that you're articulating all of the expectations of the supervisee and everything that you're committing to do as a supervisor so that your supervisee knows that. You're also going to explicitly define what specific training activities or instructional objectives y'all are going to be working on together, and you have to provide measurable criteria related to those objectives regarding what constitutes a passing evaluation or an unsatisfactory evaluation for a supervisee. For example, if they're just going through the motions and putting in FaceTime, clocking in, clocking out, but not really growing as a supervisee, and or their repertoire as a clinician is not growing, and you feel like, hey, they should probably not count these hours because they really haven't made any progress or demonstrated any learning or growth from that. You as a supervisor are allowed to give them an unsatisfactory and that evaluation and say those hours don't count. Now, if you're going to do that, you have to, in your supervisory contract, very clearly articulate the conditions under which supervisees will pass a supervisory period versus not passing the evaluation, and the conditions under which you will and won't sign off on their hours. As a supervisor, this is really important because if you get to the end of the supervisory period and you don't pass your supervisee, but this is a surprise to them because it wasn't explicitly outlined in the contract, then that's a problem for you. For supervisees, it should be a big red flag that the supervisor didn't clearly articulate the conditions under which they are unable to perform, what your mastery criteria were to get these hours signed off on. And it usually is that reflection of the supervisor not having given good feedback. If this is the first time the supervisee is hearing, they're not going to pass. In those instances, supervisees are rightly frustrated, and sometimes they will contest their experience by going to the board. So they go to the board and say, hey, I did all of the hours, but my supervisor won't sign off on them. Now the board is immediately going to ask for a copy of the supervisory contract and documentation of feedback to see if your supervisor really clearly articulated those expectations and is holding you accountable in a way that was already predetermined and not just thrown you under the bus at the last minute. So the supervisory contract is for both the supervisee's protection as well as the supervisor, making sure that everyone is on the same page with the expectations. Another requirement for field experience is that students work with multiple clients and across multiple settings. We need to be very mindful of this as supervisors, depending on the type of setting that you're working in. Because if you're working in a service delivery agency and you have your fixed number of clients that you work with, and you have your supervisee assigned to just one client on that caseload, you have to uphold your commitment to the client's progress in their programming, but also because you're committed to providing the supervision to the student, you have to uphold your commitment to make sure that they get the appropriate degree of training activities. And so say you're working with one client with whom it's all skill acquisition and no behavior reduction or other programming, or there's no opportunities for students to learn how to train staff, how to do assessments, etc. That's not okay. You committed to providing them this experience that met the BACB requirements. So it's up to you and these students to collaboratively figure out how they're going to be able to get those training activities. If it's not possible for you to offer some of them, then you really need to explain that to them in advance and say, hey, I can give you training on X, Y, and Z activities, but you're probably going to have to find a different supervisor or site to get experience for these other things for which I don't have the clients or the scope of competence. The next thing, field experience requirement, the next field experience requirement that you really need to pay attention to is the frequency and duration of supervision. This is going to vary based on the type of experience that your student is getting, if they're doing supervised field work or concentrated supervised field work. These used to be previously known as practicum and intensive practicum, thus demonstrating why you need to be staying up to date to ensure that you're providing them with both the appropriate number of supervisory contact hours per week, per month, per supervisory period, whatever it is stated in the guidelines, as well as the appropriate duration of supervision, which is usually a percentage relative to the total number of hours that they're accruing. And most importantly, and in alignment with our ethical guidelines regarding providing effective supervision, is that we are providing feedback in a timely way that actually changes our supervisee's behavior. And we're documenting it regularly. And, we've been talking this whole time about providing feedback, especially critical feedback, being one of the most difficult tasks of, the role of a supervisor in any capacity, but you just can't get around it. So I would say certainly if that's not one of your strong suits, or this is an area in your repertoire that for whatever reason you are uncomfortable developing, you're never under any obligation to supervise students pursuing their certification. So if the job requires that, it's not something that you're comfortable with or that you want to do, then maybe you should consider not taking that job. Because if your job requires you to provide supervision and you have to do it in such a way that abides by the BACB standard, that means you actually have to document and show that your feedback is being effective in changing those student repertoires. It's important to think about the specific purpose of supervision when we're talking about supervising individuals pursuing their certification. According to the BACB, the purpose of supervision is to improve and maintain the behavior analytic, professional, and ethical repertoires of the trainee and facilitate the delivery of high quality services to the trainee's clients. So the BACB highlights that the purpose, as specified by both our task list and our ethical code. So we have to make sure that we're training our supervisees to be behavior analysts in that broad sense, and not just focusing on teaching them whatever skills they need at that moment to work with clients that are on their caseload if they're working for you. We also need to train and supervise our students in this process of behavioral case conceptualization and problem solving and decision making and assistance seeking, and all of those things that they're really going to have to do independently as a clinician, and to probably train and supervise other future BCBAs on these skills, these large composite repertoires. It's really hard sometimes for supervisors to train because not only are they difficult to define, but often we haven't received, very explicit training in them ourselves. So we may even struggle to define how to teach problem solving or assistance seeking. Good supervision and training only leads to better services being delivered, which tackles the second part of that purpose statement, that facilitation piece. So that can be thought of kind of or as our driving EO for providing good supervision and training, because it's going to result in the betterment for the client. When thinking about in terms of the purpose of supervision, we're not just talking about supervising or training them related to the specific clients, you're also training them to become independent practitioners. So you have to kind of think about that domino effect or of the impact of your supervision and training affecting how they're going to work with all of their clients in the future. And it's important to remember that because you're taking on this responsibility and this undertaking very seriously. Because after they get certified and they go and start working, they might be working completely independently in whatever their work situation is and not going to have other behavior analysts to mentor them, and thus are going to be relying solely on the training that you provided them during their field experience. So you have to think about everything that you're doing during this process being for the benefit of those future clients as well. Given these purposes, the BACB has also detailed what determines effective behavior analytics supervision and how to monitor it. So in the Turner et al. 2016 article, they started off by talking about how there's two main components that really set the stage for an effective supervisory relationship. The first of which is essentially developing rapport with your supervisee, and the second being the process of setting expectations. When we think about rapport, from a behavior analytic conceptualization, we're trying to essentially pair with our supervisee. We want the supervisor to function as an SD for the availability of reinforcement, and as the context of supervision to function as an EO for the same. And if we think about that interconnected relationship between the supervisor's behavior and the supervisee's behavior, we want to develop rapport in such a way that our supervisee's behavior is also reinforcing for the supervisor, so that we want to supervise them as much as they want to be supervised by us. And developing that rapport is one of the most difficult parts for supervisors because it's, again, difficult to define and may potentially not be one of your strong suits. So when thinking about building rapport and building rapport as an analogy to pairing, obviously you're not just going to hang out with your supervisee and see what they like to do and follow their lead and try to condition yourself as a reinforcer in that manner. One of the first things that you have to do as a supervisor with your supervisee is to develop that supervisory contract and those mutually agreed upon goals and expectations. So you're kind of jumping right into the nitty gritty of what you're doing. And it's important during that process of first getting assigned a supervisee or interviewing someone who might become your supervisee that you try to get a feel for what your interpersonal relationship is going to be like. Does it seem like you generally want to keep talking to them and conversing? Do they seem like they genuinely want to be talking with you? Are they interested in working with you specifically when you talk about the training program that you have to offer them? Are you also excited about doing that and then excited about doing it with them? Um, and that goes a long way also in terms of demonstrating to them that you want to be in the supervisory relationship with them and providing this training to them. Now, a lot of supervisors may find themselves in a situation where their agency kind of just assigns students and they probably don't get a say on how many students they get assigned. Um, and it's important to be really cautious about accepting supervisees because it's a much different relationship with a greater degree of responsibility. Having a field experienced student is not the same as having a technician or staff person report to you, because you're going to be responsible for so much more than training them in their day-to-day job responsibilities. And it's really important that you have a good working relationship together. So in terms of measuring or figuring out if that rapport is at least starting off on the right foot, some of the things that they talked about in the Turner article is the supervisor reaching out to you, actively participating, coming to the supervision meetings, contacting you for additional things, for follow-up. So just like when we talked about assessing the effects of building rapport with clients, do they come to us when we go to their house for a session, or do they run away? You kind of want to think about the parallels to your supervisee's behavior and some of the ways that you can initially build up that reinforcing effectiveness of talking to you, reaching out to you, trying to at least start by kind of overdoing it with that really dense schedule of reinforcement, a lot of praise, a lot of empathy, really just making it so that they talk about you being visible, you being approachable, and certainly you're going to have many, many things in the course of your relationship with them. You're going to have to give them feedback, uh, and that's corrective and all of that. But maybe right at the beginning, that's not necessarily the time for you to do it. Maybe at the beginning, just like with our clients and during the pairing process, not putting a ton of demands on them just yet, and focusing on building that strong relationship so that when you do get to the harder pieces, that corrective feedback, those difficult tasks, where you actually have to do a lot of very systematic training and corrective feedback, they will already have a history of contacting reinforcement with you, and they're reaching out to you, and all of those behaviors won't immediately extinguish. Another thing that's important to think about early in the onset of your supervisory relationship, when you're going through that supervisory contract and that rapport building process, is really defining what that relationship is going to look like. So not just what things they're going to be trained on or what things they can expect from you, but really about how you're going to act in that role. And boundaries are critically important here because you may find yourself in a lot of multiple relationships if you don't have them. So if you're working at an agency where your supervisee is both your field experience uh, student and also an employee, right away there's going to be some potential conflicts of interest and confounds because they're going to have different training expectations potentially as a supervisee than they would have in just a typical job expectation. And if you're going to be in the dual role of both their clinical supervisor for cases that they're working on as a technician, as well as their field experience supervisor as they're pursuing their certification, it's important that you have very clear, explicit expectations for what they have to do in each of those contexts to get a passing evaluation or keep their job or whatever it is. So if they're not meeting, those supervisee expectations that you outlined, but they're meeting their job expectations, you can see how very quickly you could get frustrated, that rapport being damaged because they're not fulfilling their obligations to you in one of those modalities. And yet, even though you may terminate your relationship with them as a veteran supervisor, you still may have to work with them as their clinical supervisor for those cases that they're assigned. And that can be really awkward. What I see a lot of times is, a friendship developing between students and their supervisors. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Clearly, that means that rapport was actually developed and you all like each other and get along. But remember that it can get really kind of muddy in terms of objectivity on the supervisor side or on the supervisory side in general, maybe feeling like they can or shouldn't be as critical or, holding supervisees fast and true to the expectations that were set out if they were friends. And it can be really difficult for the supervisee if they're really getting a good training experience and, for example, feel bad about saying something to their supervisor because their friend who's also their supervisor and you see things play out multiple ways as soon as being the supervisor doesn't quite really work consistently or sort of in a way that like can hold both of those relationships in place. And you have to be really careful even with those positive friendly relationships that develop, that you make sure that you're always coming back to those explicit expectations that you talked about in terms of your relationship with them as a supervisor. Being their supervisor doesn't mean that you don't have to be nice, but you can be kind without while maintaining consistency about your boundaries and without withdrawing your boundaries or manipulating their boundaries to suit the supervisee, because that's not how it's supposed to work. So it's sometimes very difficult for supervisees to also separate and compartmentalize their scope of competence and expertise as it relates to sometimes multiple of these trainings. If suppose they are an OT or a speech path and also, pursuing their BACB certification. And what happens is a lot of times they keep almost trying to train their supervisor based on these things that they already know. And sometimes in the best intentions, it's like, oh, did you know that, this other perspective may be helpful or something. So you're coming out with the best of intentions, but really forgetting that they are a student and here to be trained, and they're not in any kind of peer collaborative relationship. So it's important that you know those aspects of how that relationship is going to work is defined at the outset, so it's not surprising anyone. So when we're defining our performance expectations of our practicum or field experience supervisees, especially within the context of that contract, we have to make sure we're pinpointing these expectations and making sure that we're not assuming our supervisees are going to read between the lines. And this is particularly important for those soft skills, professionalism skills, how you expect them to communicate with you or communicate with clients, abiding by ethical codes and such. You really want to make sure that you explicitly define all of these things, because remember that our supervisees may be coming to us having worked with at least other faculty members or clinical supervisors, and they may have had different expectations or definitions of these behaviors. And it's important to set your supervisee up for success by really articulating how you expect them to engage in these different behaviors. And it's also important that you are explicitly separating any expectations relative to multiple roles that they might be in with you. So again, separating your employee expectations from expectations relevant to their field experience, and acting with you as their supervisor in that capacity. And remember, we want to set clear measurement and evaluation criteria as well. And this is typically done in the context of supervising students on that evaluation form that you're going to create to evaluate and give them feedback during each supervision session that you have with them. You're going to have to set that up such that it evaluates their progress towards each of those expectations and objectives that you've articulated. And depending on how you set that up, like, a Likert scale or satisfactory, not satisfactory, etc., you can ensure that in your supervisory contracts, those expectations for, you don't say how many consecutive unsatisfactory or something like that they can get before no more. Um, or a more intensive intervention is going to be warranted, or potentially they're going to have to terminate your supervisory relationship with them. So make sure that all of those criteria for what are the various consequences for sort of getting that multiple types of feedback are clearly articulated and pinpointed to your supervisees with respect to their performance. Another important thing that they mentioned in the assigned readings was to make sure that you're reviewing confidentiality with your supervisee. And we talked at length about confidentiality as it relates to clients during ethics, but within the context of supervising students pursuing their field experience, it's important that you explain your commitment to maintaining the confidentiality of their progress during that process, but also the potential risks for breach in confidentiality, especially in the context of group supervision, which we will talk about later. It's also important that you make clear or or honest about any reporting requirements that you may have, which one of the main ones being that should they engage in any unethical behavior that can't be resolved informally, then you do have a requirement to report that to the BACB. Even before they become certified as a result of some type of action, on the BACB in further remediating those issues, or putting some kind of suspension when they actually can't apply or take the exam for a certain period of time. And that happens in the case of the most egregious unethical behavior. And depending on the context that you're working with the supervisees in, if they're employees for your agencies as well as your field experience students, you may be required to report their performance as it relates to their field experience to their boss or HR or something like that, or at the agency itself, particularly when concerning or unethical behaviors arise. And any, other regulatory state agencies, such as if you're a mandated reporter. So it's important to think about all of this and putting it all out on the table, because if something comes up and they're not surprised and saying things like, I didn't know you were going to talk to my faculty, or I didn't know you were going to tell my boss, or anything like that, so that they are very clearly understanding the limits of the confidentiality that's going to be maintained in the supervisory relationship. And again, making sure that you're considering any limits to confidentiality that are a result of any dual relationships that you may have. Now, just like with our clients, with your supervisees again, because one of the purposes of acting as a supervisor for someone pursuing their certification is to actually train and improve their repertoire. You should be doing a baseline assessment of your supervisee's repertoire to see what skills they're coming to the table with and which skills to build off of and reinforce and maintain, and also figure out what needs to be targeted for explicit training. One of the recommendations that they make in the article is that one assessment you can get your supervisee's repertoire is through reviewing the course syllabi for those courses that they've already taken. And this is good information for you to have an understanding of what things they've already learned about in the classroom, or watch videos or readings or assignments they've already done, especially if you request to see any of those assignments. So if you had to complete the behavior reduction plan or something like that for class, maybe asking them if you can see what plan they wrote and things like that. But again, I caution you from especially only looking at the syllabus and thinking that just because these topics were addressed in class and they got a passing grade, that any of those specific things were mastered. Because, grades are not a reflection of mastery. And obviously, a person could have done really well on some things in class and really not well on others. But, grades can be aggregated and such to not give you sort of that the gradient information and what skills they may actually have, um, or any other information that you can go off of, um, is needed. So don't just go off of the course syllabi or the grades and presume that you understand their repertoire. Should probably also review any other credentials that they may have, such as if they have an RBT or other type of training under their belt that have specific credentials, and thinking about looking into those credentials and how they earn them. So what type of competency measures may have demonstrated or they may have had to take for trainings and things like that within those credentials. And then also taking that with a grain of salt is, just like when you look at the syllabi, to make sure that you're not over assuming any skill sets just because of a credential that they may have. Because just like with your client that you may be working with, you don't know the degree of integrity that any of those skills were assessed with previously. Um, and so it's just to give you some preliminary information about what type of instruction or training or experience that your supervisees may have already been exposed to. Another great thing to do during this initial process of working with your supervisees is to figure out what skills you're going to train them on by asking them to do a self-assessment. So maybe using the BACP task list to work off of regarding all of the different objectives that students are going to need to meet in order to take and pass the BCBA exam. So that's one kind of tool you can use to design a self-assessment, and maybe you use it again or create a Likert scale where your supervisees would go through each of the checklist items and see and tell you whether they feel very competent or slightly competent or very uncomfortable, versus less about to remember that. And at the end of the day, also still remember that it's just going to be a self-report. So in using something like that and designing those tools, it's important to not only ask, how comfortable or competent they feel doing those things, but based on what. So how much experience have they had doing those things, or how many hours in class did they work on that? Do they only have to do it in class, or do they also have experience doing it in the field prior to coming to you? And then think about giving some opportunities to ask them more questions, and maybe you haven't demonstrated some of those skills or knowledge bases during your actual assessment of the repertoire. Um, because one of the best ways to assess skills is to observe it directly. So you can see the degree to which they can actually do the things, even if you use a role play setting or something like that. Now, this one's obviously going to be more time intensive and cumbersome. And again, as a supervisor, it's important that you're always taking into account all of the responsibilities you have as a supervisor in context of all of your other responsibilities as a clinician at the agency, because um, a lot of times supervisors think, oh, I'm going to get these field experience students and they'll be a great helping hand. They've already taken some of the courses, they should know what they're doing, and they're just kind of here to practice and get their hours. And that couldn't be further from the truth. As a supervisor, you're essentially taking on another client in a different domain when you're supervising students pursuing their field experience, because you're in the role of directly training and creating interventions to improve their repertoire. And just like you would design a skill acquisition program for a client, which is a lot of work and responsibility, you need to consider very carefully the workload involved in supervision before, taking on any specific volume of supervisees. Now, when we're talking about training our supervisees in the supervisory curriculum, some very kind of specific categories of skills that you should be responsible for teaching your supervisees are outlined by the board. So behavior change procedures, specialized procedures, are they related to some niche area that, feeding procedures or severe self-injury behaviors, how to take data, how to design those data collection systems and how to analyze those data to make clinical decisions, case conceptualization, problem solving, decision making, resource seeking, how to find literature, reaching out for counsel, whether it's related to clinical oversight or other ethical issues. And so these are kind of the really broad categories or the nature of supervision that, those composite repertoires of multiple different component skills. And you have to think about in your role as a clinician in the same way that you would think about in your role as a clinician. When you think about being a supervisor, you're making sure that you're not only limiting their training experience to the needs of the specific client and really doing a lot of work about what happens behind the scenes. So outside of the role of technician that supervisees often find themselves in, they should really be getting trained in what you, the BCBA, is doing start to finish. They're not there to be trained as RBTs. They're not there to be trained as paras. They're there to be trained as BCBAs in this supervisory relationship. So how do they go through that assessment process? How do you design those objectives for behavior change with your clients? How do you consult the literature to figure out how you're going to design your programs or why you're designing programs in a given way while you're selecting data collection procedures and why you're designing the data sheets the way you are, all of those bigger fields that we're responsible for doing as a BCBA. That's what you should be training your supervisees to do. And this is one of the more concerning trends in the field with regards to supervision, is that largely supervisees are getting field experience hours or more of those direct hours by being, paras or RBTs or those direct implementers or change agents or, doing technician work and things like that. And this is a bit of a conflict of interest because agencies want students to come in and be field experience supervisees because they need to fill in those technician roles. And there's this assumption that if an individual is pursuing their master's degree or their certification, that they're going to be better trained and better equipped technicians to work with clients. And we have to remember that as a supervisor of an aspiring behavior analyst, that's not your job in that role. Your job is not to train them to be a technician. Your job is to train them to be a BCBA. So as I mentioned earlier, think about the problem solving in any capacity. It's one of the most difficult skills to teach or train our supervisees. And in the article, they kind of broke down problem solving generically as, identifying the problem, determining the kind of potential alternatives or ways to solve the problem, and deciding on one of those solutions over others, and then evaluating the effects of implementing that solution. This expectation goes above and beyond what we would typically expect of employees, staff, technicians, and such. It's particularly important to train or supervisees who are pursuing their certification on this skill because it's a critical component of their practitioner repertoire. Problem solving can be complex, such as in evaluating ethical scenarios or making clinical decisions, or such as figuring out how to access the literature. Regardless, it's important to focus on this in supervision and actively model this process for your supervisees on a regular basis. Otherwise, I don't think that your supervisee would get a lot of exposure to this process and be able to learn just from imitating because so much of it is done, quote unquote, behind the scenes or even covertly. Throughout this whole process of training and supervising, supervise your students of training and supervising your students who are pursuing field experience, you have to ethically and in accordance with the BACV's policies for supervisors, evaluate the effects of our supervision. And it's important that we're constantly reflecting on the data from our supervisees, actual progress towards meeting these goals, as well as the social validity data to keep our practices in check. So often I'll talk to a supervisor and they're like, well, I'm getting feedback and nothing's changing. I've already told them to do this differently, and nothing's changing. I've trained them in it, yet they're still not doing the right thing, and so on and so forth. And just with our clients or our other staff, we need to be looking at the effects of our training and supervision techniques and not sort of fall into the slippery slope of mentalism when we consider why progress may or may not be happening. As far as the supervisee's behavior, if you're giving them satisfactory progress every week and on paper they seem to be making progress, yet your qualitative or anecdotal data don't corroborate this, you don't think that they're growing or changing effectively as it would seem on paper, then what's probably happening is that the way that you're measuring their progress is not sensitive enough, or your data systems that you set up are not valid to capture exactly what you're looking for. So it's important to consider the social validity of that experience. So not only is yours providing learning and improving performance, but also is this enjoyable in a mutually beneficial way as a supervisory relationship? Are they understanding why they're learning and what they're learning, the importance of it, and why they're getting feedback in certain ways? So when you're conducting the social validity assessments, it's really important to continuously and from the get-go implement them, and not to do it in reaction to progress not being made, or you start feeling like the supervisory relationship has become strained. It also sets up the expectation that you're actively soliciting feedback from them throughout the process if you start off with it and keep it ongoing. It's important that you really consider the power differential between a supervisor and a supervisee, and how that may impact the truthfulness of the results we may be getting on a social validity assessment. So you're the supervisee, you may be having a horrible experience, but not saying anything because you don't want them to kick you out of their program, or you fear retaliation or something like that. And those are all reasonable things to assume. So it's good to think about how you can mitigate against sort of that power differential as a supervisor. So one of the things that can be done is seeing if there's any degree of an anonymity that you can bring into the social validity assessment. And this can obviously be hard to do when you only have one or two supervisees, because it's easy to tell who is submitting what information. And this anonymity can also be a double-edged sword, because it may sort of provide supervisees with a degree of comfort about providing that feedback. But for you as a supervisor, if the feedback is anonymous, and if you have a fair number of supervisees, you may not be able to figure out who's having a good experience and who's not. So those overt behaviors that we talked about earlier about being, willing and showing up and excited and enthusiastic to work with you are great, more direct corroborating variables. But, really when you explain this process of why you're soliciting this feedback, it's important to let your supervisees know that there's not going to be any negative consequences or retribution related to them saying that they're not having a good time. And you can sort of point back to your ethical commitment and requirement of having to evaluate the effects of your supervision and taking their feedback into account to shape your behavior. All of that explanation and rationale that is modeling good supervision or good supervisory practices to your supervisee, and hopefully they can give you feedback on what they experience, and having to fill these things out as a supervisor can shape your process and further inform you about how they might use these processes as supervisors themselves after they get certified. As a field experienced supervisor, your supervisees are required to get individual supervision. They can also get group supervision, but while they don't have to be in group supervision, they absolutely have to get individual supervision. And if they do choose to get group and individual supervision, group cannot account for more than 50% of their supervision requirements for a supervisory period. um, During individual supervision, you as a supervisor need to be placing the bulk of your efforts in terms of making sure that this is a productive relationship between you and your supervisees. Be sure to check out all the appendices in the Sellers et al. Article for suggestions that they have around how to structure individual supervision meetings and activities that you can do during them. One of the biggest and best suggestions for individual supervision meetings is to make sure that they are regularly scheduled and that they are focused. Make sure that you have an agenda, and you want to make sure that you send that agenda to your supervisees beforehand so that they can review and prepare for all of those things that you're planning on discussing with them, and working with them during that meeting so that nothing catches them by surprise. This is also one of those professionalism skills that is the degree to which they show up prepared to a meeting based on the agenda that you can evaluate them on. It's really important that you have a focus to each of your individual supervision sessions, because otherwise it's really easy to stray away from talking about any of the objectives and expectations that you're working on with the supervisee and that you're evaluating them on. And this can turn into a tangential discussion about that may still be about supervision, but not really about the training and developing of the repertoire of a future behavior analyst. It's particularly problematic when you have supervision sessions that are doubling as clinical oversight sessions. So it's more of the BCBA providing the oversight for the case that the supervisee is working on as a technician, and less about the actual development of that supervisee's repertoire as a future behavior analyst. When you keep things focused on the objectives and expectations in the context of individual supervision, it's going to make it a lot easier for you as a supervisor to be able to give concrete, objective feedback and evaluations. And at the end of the agenda, making sure that you always solicit feedback about their experience going into the supervisory period during which they're accruing hours, as well as during the supervision sessions. So you can really reflect on that feedback and know, um, and show how you're thinking, reading that and changing your practices for the future. When we talk about focusing on the individual to provide these service and performance expectations that are outlined in your supervisory contract, just like when we get the assessment results from our clients, we're not going to tackle everything concurrently or all at once. You can take all those expectations that are identified in the contract, break them down more linearly, and create benchmarks for your supervisees, kind of like goalposts to have expectations met. So that's how you can structure these individual supervision sessions to make sure you're focusing on those specific skills that you're benchmarking and how to evaluate them. And that's going to keep you, the supervisor, open in terms of making sure you're actually providing the appropriate training and response opportunities for the supervisee to meet those benchmarks. This ensures that you are training that broad generalization repertoire that your student needs those behavioral cusps too. One of the most important things, always as a supervisor, is it's not something that you can just put on an agenda, but maybe something that you have in your own notes to prompt you to do this, but always reinforce every time that your supervisee is applying your feedback. Because it really shows that every time you're getting things, or you're telling them things that, there's a reason for them, and that it results in some meaningful change as a result of them taking that feedback and running with it. But if don't use those opportunities to reinforce them applying your feedback, then it's reasonable to suggest that it's going to extinguish over time, because that's just how behavior works. So group supervision is also something that's allowed to count as your supervision percentage requirements for the board, but they do have some restrictions around it. First and foremost, when you're conducting group supervision, you can have no more than 10 individuals in the group at the same time. And those 10 individuals should all be pursuing their field experience as well. So we don't want to have some type of group training that you're giving on crisis management or something, and you have people in there who are staff and also your supervisees. You can count that as group supervision towards the BACD. There are some specific benefits of group supervision that were discussed in the assigned article. The first of which being that it allows for the opportunity of peer feedback. Setting up group supervision in such a way that you're not just talking to each of the individual students about things going on with them specifically, but setting up that opportunity for peers to contribute to that discussion and give feedback about their experience, about how they might act in the situation, whether or not they found themselves in those specific situations, and more. It's also really creating or setting the stage for what can be continued collaboration and networking sort of outside of graduate school. So it helps with really maintaining that verbal community and how to set up group supervision. Because if you set it up effectively in such a way that it proves beneficial and occasions productive discussion, that really models for supervisees the benefits of having continued group supervision and collaboration once they graduate, get certified, and work in the field. It also provides great opportunity for observational learning, specifically around situations that each of the individual supervisees might not have expressly experienced yet, but they can see situations that other entities may be experiencing and learn from the description and discussion of what is going on, so that they can take that lesson with them into the future should they find themselves in similar situations. And one last thing that they talked about as a benefit of group supervision was really having opportunities to practice presenting and engaging in public speaking. This is a really excellent time and context to do this because you can create the safe, contrived environment in which your supervisees have to practice giving a presentation or even a 2-minute elevator pitch for when someone asks them what ABA is, or certainly when someone asks them to explain why they're working in a field in response to some of its controversies and its history of harm and things like that. Giving them the opportunity to practice responding to these things, or working on formal or informal presentations and soliciting feedback from the group, because everyone's coming to the table with different experiences, and they might be able to give you feedback on different responses or reactions to the presentations. And this is a really great opportunity to decrease some of the reluctance that that fear and anxiety that clinicians may have about speaking publicly about some things that are hard to talk about. When it comes to group supervision, though, it's important to consider some specific barriers that are unique to group supervision. Since there are more individuals in the group and everyone's coming from different places in their trainings, just like with individual supervision, you should have that specific kind of agenda going into your group supervision meeting. And obviously setting it beforehand to make sure you're creating expectations for the supervisory session that are going to be beneficial to everyone's learning. The most common problem that I see with the way group supervision is conducted is the notion that let's talk about something that's a subjective experience, and maybe others talk about issues that individual supervisees are speaking to personally. So if some of their peers who aren't working in schools or haven't come into that issue, it's easy for them to check out or use their phone or email or whatever and not really fully attend to what is happening during supervision. So it's important when creating an agenda to decide what to include by going over each supervisee's contracts and mapping out how their needs can be met in a manner that is cohesive and relevant to other group members as well. When you're giving feedback to an individual during group supervision, it's being done in front of their peers. Providing feedback in public forum is tough. So if there's any type of, especially if there's any type of corrective feedback, you certainly don't want to embarrass the student or supervisee, but you do want to make sure that you're providing feedback to such things in such a way that others too can learn, even if they aren't from that situation. Sometimes supervisors will choose to provide that feedback individually or via the forum. But what happens in those situations is if the peers don't see the supervisor address it, they may assume that it's okay for, that being the right way to talk about whatever the topic is, because that feedback is not being given to them. And then it's considered tacit approval by other supervisees in the group. It can take some practice for supervisors to figure out how to be able to give that feedback in a public way so that it doesn't embarrass their students, but also is time sensitive and effective, and models to the rest of the group the importance of that feedback or whatever correction is being delivered. Then, of course, in any group, there's always the difficulty of managing any type of off task behavior. So, in how you design your agenda and your activities for group supervision, I think having it so that you're switching up activities and requiring different types of active responding from different participants, and not just saying, you will contribute to the discussion. Uh, that's important in terms of keeping everyone actively engaged and discouraging any off task behavior. And of course, coming back to you, creating those specific expectations to evaluate on task behavior, that's really what's going to set the occasion for your supervisees to know what kind of involvement you expect from them in those contexts or sessions. And that kind of relates to the providing feedback point as well. I think oftentimes concerning behaviors come up during group supervision that can really snowball in a way that's different than individual supervision, especially when we're talking about or trying things that you're experiencing as a supervisee. It's easy for that group supervision to turn into a venting session. And very, very frequently, this does turn into one where everyone's kind of venting and commiserating with one another, and there's no productive learning going on. And it's important that you, as a supervisor, provide a space for supervisees to share concerns that they have, but also reframing that in focusing on, okay, what are we going to do about this? Where are we going from here? Apart from all of us just sitting here and complaining, or, having the space to just like sit with all of the emotions that are showing up as a result of engaging with this topic. Um, and really modeling those professionalism behaviors, I think, is relevant to the context of supervision. And it's really important when it comes to protecting client confidentiality and things like that, because oftentimes in supervisory sessions, it's easy for, even if you're not using identifying information, it's easy for other students in those sessions to figure out what clients are talking about or what supervisor you're talking about or agencies or other professionals. And then just from hearing about these bad experiences, these can really change their views of those people or places. And that's not really fair. So there's a time and place, obviously, for having those more appropriate venting sessions, but I don't think group supervision is really the time to do it. One thing that I think is useful to those situations, if your supervisees are having specific concerns that they want to talk about, is having them submit those in advance so that you can make sure there's a space in the agenda to bring them up. And then also that gives you an opportunity as a supervisor to preemptively vet the concern in the discussion that may result from the concern to determine if, that's something that should even be brought up in group supervision, or if it would be better to be discussed in the context of individual supervision, or maybe it's appropriate for another group supervision, giving the students some feedback on how you're going to bring it up and how you want to frame the discussion. Certainly any preliminary guidance on what they should be doing to preserve confidentiality and maintain professionalism. That way, it doesn't kind of snowball out of your control as a supervisor. Now, when you detect any of these barriers coming up in effective supervision, it's important that we go back to our performance discrepancy analyses and really do that. Can you want to know how analyses of the problem and think about how our own behavior may be contributing to those issues? Did you properly train them? Did you sufficiently develop the rapport with them that, or was it insufficient and damaging the supervisory relationship? Do they have all of the resources to make sure that they can effectively perform and meet whatever expectations you're setting forth? And so when you're going through this analysis and figuring out how to remediate these issues, it's important to explain that to the supervisee. So whatever is going to change, it's important to show the supervisee that you put a thoughtful, careful attention into analyzing the contingencies and why they're not meeting their expectations. So practicing what you preach as a behavior analyst and coming up with a functionally relevant and appropriate intervention for um, for that mismatch of expectation. And especially in these cases, actively acknowledging and addressing your role in those performance discrepancies. So, whether it was that you didn't give sufficient training, whether it was that you were being too harsh in your feedback, really taking account of your responsibility and your shortcoming and accepting that accountability for your role in them not meeting their expectations. This goes a long way with maintaining the record whenever you have to give critical feedback or you design more intrusive intervention plans. It's because you have historically demonstrated to the supervisee that you're in this together with them. It's not just about what they're doing right or wrong, it's also about the relationship between what they're doing right or wrong and your effectiveness as a supervisor. And so when you do that, not only is it modeling those good supervisory practices, but it goes a long way with maintaining trust and rapport with them so that you're not there to just look over their shoulder and judge them, but you're really in this to train them and that you're really invested in their outcomes. So when it comes to the most common issues that I hear supervisors report on, these aligned with the same things that came up in the Sellers, Blank, and Valentino article related to disorganization and poor time management, poor interpersonal skills, and difficulty accepting and applying feedback. The authors gave some great overt behavioral indicators that these may be the underlying kind of deficit composite repertoires, as well as some suggestions for how to remediate them. These soft skills are ones that I see supervisors struggle with pretty often. And some of it stems from supervisors thinking that you're a grown up, you're in a master's program, you want to be here. I'm giving you my time and services as a supervisor, but I'm training you to be a behavior analyst. I'm teaching you how to manage your time or teaching you how to speak to people or apply feedback are not specifically behavior analytic skills. And so what I see is supervisors getting very frustrated because even when they do give feedback on these things, if that feedback is not sufficient in changing the repertoire, they get frustrated with supervisees and tend to fall down that mental trap of thinking that, these students that they're working with are not just good fits, they're not cut out for this, or they don't care, or these kind of teleological explanations. And what I would say is, when you find yourself falling down that slippery slope of thinking that way, think about again how these are actual skills. It's not something that's inherently good or bad about the person, and that we develop these skills over time through our past history or experiences. And if you've never had to manage your time very meticulously before, it's reasonable to suggest or to expect that you're not going to be able to automatically know how to do it all of a sudden. And these things can really damage the rapport between the supervisors and supervisee and really impede the supervisee's progress towards focusing on those more concrete behavior analytic goals and expectations, which is why I think it's important for supervisors to expect that this might be a problem and preemptively address it and provide some training. The disorganization and time management thing, a lot of clinicians themselves are really bad at it and kind of model these skills for their supervisees before you get into this field. You probably never had to keep a really stringent calendar or schedule your appointments and things like that. So it's important during that initial process of working with your supervisee that you're setting up a supervisory contract and setting the schedule of all your meetings and things like that, asking them, how are you going to do this? Do you keep an electronic calendar? Do you keep a paper and pencil calendar? Do you use alerts? And if the supervisee is like, oh, I don't use anything like that, that should be a huge indicator to you that you probably need to kind of proactively work on these skills in terms of even modeling how you manage your time and stay organized. And everyone has different systems for how they do this. So it's not that your way is the right way. It might be that they need a little guidance, exposure to multiple exemplars to focus more proactively on setting up systems for themselves than just waiting for it to become a problem. And the disorganization time management thing really plays into the burden that we see with our supervisees, because it can really result in the workload kind of snowballing because you're not getting things done in an efficient way. And by showing our supervisees how to manage time properly, you can hold them accountable to that. So checking this, did you do it when you scheduled it or didn't? If you didn't, what got in the way? Or did it just end up taking longer than you thought? All of those useful skills to figure out and teach your supervisees so that they can be as successful as possible and not having this whole process turn into something overtly aversive. With the interpersonal skills, this is again tough and ambiguous to define because we all have different ideas and expectations for what constitutes appropriate or accurate or correct interpersonal skills, however you want to define it. So I do think it's important that when it comes to how you want your supervisee to communicate with you or other professionals or other clients, that you articulate that very explicitly, especially if there's specific guidelines related to the agency regarding how to do that, and reflect on the fact that you um, were raised in a different generation, but how we communicate with each other continues to evolve over time. So whereas you might not think it's appropriate to text an employee or supervisee, they may think it's appropriate based on their history. So again, never expecting them to read between the lines and figure this out from trial and error, because the more they contact extinction and punishment, the more aversive the process. And when we're talking about difficulty accepting and applying feedback, really thinking about how the way that you're getting feedback is directly playing into those responses that you're getting with them, not accepting or not applying it. Often, when not applying feedback, it could be a function of them not really understanding the feedback that you gave or how to apply it, or not having the opportunity to apply it. And if you think back to our module that we did when we talked about designing effective feedback systems, this is where it's really kind of the formative and summative model that wins the design, because the design is great, because not only are you giving them feedback, but then right before they have the opportunity to apply it, you're going to prime them by really getting it and getting it in such a way that it explicitly identifies what they should and shouldn't be doing in that moment, thereby making it more salient. One of the last areas that they talked about related to the supervisory relationship, they essentially just called it relationship conflict. And whether we're talking about this kind of personality mismatch or whether there's actual specific differences, irreconcilable differences between like worldview and cultural variables and things like that. And it's important, especially after you've already committed to supervising this individual, that you determine the degree to which you can be flexible in accepting or even tolerating the way that they present to you. Because you don't want to immediately dismiss something or dismiss someone just because you don't get along with them. You're not going to get along with everyone that you have to work with. And whether it's clients or other supervisory employees, professionals, think about it in service of your values to be a good supervisor, and think about it in terms of your values to yourself and the boundaries that you set. Not everything is about a conflict in terms of perspective or a conflict in terms of disagreement. Some conflicts go straight to your humanity, and it's important to be able to recognize sort of the nature of a conflict with a supervisee. And continuously kind of monitoring things that may rub you the wrong way about your supervisee, to make sure that you actually are letting go or not letting it kind of result in any implicit or explicit bias towards that supervisee because you have these personality differences or whatever that is. Because just because someone says that they're not going to let something bother them doesn't mean that that's actually going to happen in terms of their behavior or not lead to underlying tension between you and the supervisee. So you really want to think about how you can continuously monitor to make sure you're not letting these differences affect your ability to supervise them and give them a proper supervisory experience, but also what's socially valid to them. And certainly, if there's going to be some difference between you and your supervisee that you just cannot get over, and it's going to impact your ability or continue to impact your ability to be an effective supervisor, then just with our clients, you can refer them out. And when we talk about referring them out, it's important that we are, highlighting our role in why that supervisory relationship isn't going to be effective or cannot be effective, because focusing on the good things that they bring on the table, bring to the table, so that you're getting them a reference, or specifically consulting with another behavior analyst to take them as a supervisor. It's not like, this person, blah blah blah, I want to focus on the positives and the good things about the repertoire that they're bringing to the table, so that you're not also inherently biasing whoever it is that you're referring them to. And also, so you're not communicating to the student in such a way that would make them start to internalize these things about themselves, or make it part of their subtle behaviors or covert repertoires. And just because you're having a difficult time being an effective supervisor doesn't mean that someone else wouldn't have been an effective supervisor to them. And that's really important, that you're not honestly like damaging the ego of the supervisee. And so you're not making it such that your opinion of them is an inherent reflection of their ability to develop into a good practitioner. During this process, it's really important that you're maintaining the utmost professionalism and respect towards your supervisees, because it can very quickly turn into fueled by emotions and things like that, depending on what type of variable that is impeding your ability to be an effective supervisor to them. Um, it can very quickly turn or snowball into something that you can come back from. So it's always a great opportunity to seek guidance of another BCBA to give you an objective third party view of how things are going, and guidance on how to effectively terminate that relationship. And after that, really reflecting on how that process went, and you were, you know, at least able to end things on amicable terms. So, some final thoughts about this unit, and talking about specifically supervising and training aspiring behavior analysts. As the supervisor, if you are the gatekeeper to this individual entering our field as a practitioner, the faculty is one side of things, because we can control to whatever extent possible whether or not they pass classes, using grading and things like that. But passing a class doesn't actually automatically mean mastering everything that they need to be competent. But you, as the supervisor, signing off on those forms and those hours is really greenlighting them into taking the exam and getting into the field. And you need to take that responsibility very seriously. Because often in these more toxic supervisory relationships, where the supervisors just kind of push them through so that they don't have to deal with that person anymore, and then they also don't have to deal with the uncomfortable nature of terminating the supervisory relationship or not signing off on hours or something. I hear a lot of supervisors talk about in the context of, well, they're never going to pass the exam, so it doesn't matter. Well, you don't know that. And you can do a lot of exam prep and a lot of exam cramming and pass the exam. But if they haven't demonstrated competency, or that they're proficient in these practical skills, and you're signing off on them, that's an ethical violation on your part. You should never be signing off on hours that you don't believe really demonstrated growth and progress in meeting these expectations. And be very mindful of the lure of that negative reinforcement, because this, again, is a very serious undertaking, and you need to protect not only the integrity of our field and the practitioners that enter it, but ultimately, this is about consumer protection. If you're signing off on someone's hours and you don't believe that they've actually demonstrated the skills that they need to be a clinician, then you are in part at least responsible if they enter the field and practice unethically. So the broader picture always has to be client centered, again, in the context of our ethical code.